Gradually, dissatisfaction among the Muslim population, which lacked political and economic status under the colonial system, gave rise to demands for greater political autonomy and eventually independence from France. In May 1945, the uprising against the occupying French forces was suppressed through what is now known as the Sétif-Nkwelma massacre. Tensions between the two population groups came to a head in 1954, when the first violent events of what was later called the Algerian War began after the publication of the Declaration of November 1, 1954. Historians have estimated that between 30,000 and 150,000 Harkis and their dependents were killed by the National Liberation Front (FLN) or by lynch mobs in Algeria. The FLN used hit-and-run attacks in Algeria and France as part of its war, and the French conducted severe reprisals. The war led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Algerians and hundreds of thousands of injuries. Historians, like Alistair Horn and Raymond Aron, state that the actual number of Algerian Muslim war dead was far greater than the original FLN and official French estimates but was less than the 1 million deaths claimed by the Algerian government after independence. Horn estimated Algerian casualties during the span of 8 years to be around 700,000. The war uprooted more than 2 million Algerians. The war against French rule concluded in 1962, when Algeria gained complete independence following the March 1962 Evian agreements and the July 1962 self-determination referendum. The first 3 decades of independence 1962-1991 the number of European Pied Noirs who fled Algeria totaled more than 900,000 between 1962 and 1964. The exodus to mainland France accelerated after the Oran massacre of 1962, in which hundreds of militants entered European sections of the city and began attacking civilians. Algeria's first president was the Front de Libération Nationale (FLN) leader Ahmed Ben Bella. Morocco's claim to portions of western Algeria led to the Sand War in 1963. Ben Bella was overthrown in 1965 by Houari Boumediene, his former ally and defense minister. Under Ben Bella, the government had become increasingly socialist and authoritarian. Boumediene continued this trend. However, he relied much more on the army for his support, and reduced the sole legal party to a symbolic role. He collectivized agriculture and launched a massive industrialization drive. Oil extraction facilities were nationalized. This was especially beneficial to the leadership after the international 1973 oil crisis. Boumediene's successor, Chadli Benjedid, introduced some liberal economic reforms. He promoted a policy of Arabization in Algerian society and public life. Teachers of Arabic, brought in from other Muslim countries, spread conventional Islamic thought in schools and sowed the seeds of a return to Orthodox Islam. The Algerian economy became increasingly dependent on oil, leading to hardship when the price collapsed during the 1980s oil glut. Economic recession caused by the crash in world oil prices resulted in Algerian social unrest during the 1980s. By the end of the decade, Benjedid introduced a multi-party system. Political parties developed, such as the Islamic Salvation Front (FIS), a broad coalition of Muslim groups. Civil War 1991-2002 and aftermath. Edit in December 1991 the Islamic Salvation Front dominated the first of 2 rounds of legislative elections. Fearing the election of an Islamist government, the authorities intervened on January 11, 1992, cancelling the elections. Benjedid resigned and a High Council of State was installed to act as the presidency. It banned the FIS, triggering a civil insurgency between the front's armed wing, the Armed Islamic Group, and the National Armed Forces, in which more than 100,000 people are thought to have died. The Islamist militants conducted a violent campaign of civilian massacres. At several points in the conflict, the situation in Algeria became a point of international concern, most notably during the crisis surrounding Air France Flight 8969, a hijacking perpetrated by the Armed Islamic Group. The Armed Islamic Group declared a ceasefire in October 1997. Algeria held elections in 1999, considered biased by international observers and most opposition groups, which were won by President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. He worked to restore political stability to the country and announced a Civil Concord initiative, approved in a referendum, under which many political prisoners were pardoned, and several thousand members of armed groups were granted exemption from prosecution under a limited amnesty, in force until January 13, 2000. The AIS disbanded and levels of insurgent violence fell rapidly. The group Salafist pour la Prédication et le Combat GSPC, a splinter group of the Armed Islamic Group, continued a terrorist campaign against the government. Bouteflika was re-elected in the April 2004 presidential election after campaigning on a program of national reconciliation. The program comprised economic, institutional, political and social reform to modernize the country, raise living standards, and tackle the causes of alienation. It also included a second amnesty initiative, the Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation, which was approved in a referendum in September 2005. It offered amnesty to most guerrillas and government security forces. In November 2008, the Algerian constitution was amended following a vote in parliament, removing the two-term limit on presidential incumbents. This change enabled Bouteflika to stand for re-election in the 2009 presidential elections, and he was re-elected in April 2009. During his election campaign and following his re-election, Bouteflika promised to extend the program of national reconciliation and a 150 billion spending program to create 3 million new jobs, the construction of 1 million new housing units, and to continue public sector and infrastructure modernization programs. A continuing series of protests throughout the country started on December 28, 2010, inspired by similar protests across the Middle East and North Africa. On February 24, 2011, the government lifted Algeria's 19-year-old state of emergency. The government enacted legislation dealing with political parties, the electoral code, and the representation of women in elected bodies. In April 2011, Bouteflika promised further constitutional and political reform. However, elections are routinely criticized by opposition groups as unfair, and international human rights groups say that media censorship and harassment of political opponents continue. On April 2, 2019, Bouteflika resigned from the presidency after mass protests against his candidacy for a fifth term in office. In December 2019, Abdelmadjid Tebboune became Algeria's president, after winning the first round of the presidential election with a record abstention rate, the highest of all presidential elections since Algeria's democracy in 1989. Tebboune is accused to be close to the military and being loyal to the deposed president. Tebboune rejects these accusations, claiming to be the victim of a witch hunt. He also reminds his detractors that he was expelled from the government in August 2017 at the instigation of oligarchs languishing in prison.